Hey, what's up guys? John here. Rent control is coming to Florida. Rent control is coming to Florida. You don't know what rent control is. Rent control is a set of guidelines and laws in which landlords have to operate inside of. And every jurisdiction, municipality, and state and county is different that enacts rent control. Look at Los Angeles, look at New York. They're pretty different, but they do have a lot of similarities. Now that's coming to Florida. It's coming to Florida in a very big way. It was just approved 6-0 in Tampa. And what does this look like? What does this look like for property owners? What does this look like for renters? Well, first and foremost, I believe that rents are very, very expensive. General appreciation on rents were about 3%. In places like Tampa, you're seeing 30-35% rent appreciation instead of a year. That's insane. Miami, 58%. Things are not affordable. But we have to look at places that have enacted rent control, and what has that done for the people and the citizens of these locations? Well, look at LA, look at New York. Los Angeles and New York rents are going through the roof. So expensive to live in these areas. And why would they be expensive when they've enacted rent control? Well, what ultimately happens is that if general rent appreciation is 8 or 10% a year in these areas, and the landlords are only allowed to increase their rents 3%, that means there's a 7% spread every year that's getting built into their rent, and it's compounding. So if they were to rent an apartment 10 years ago for $1,000 in LA, now that same apartment might be $3,000, and so they'd say, why would I live somewhere else and pay an extra $24,000 per year, an extra $2,000 per month? I wouldn't, right? And so ultimately what happens is that there is more demand for housing than there's available supply because people don't want to relocate. And because of that, what ultimately happens is then it's he or she who can pay the most will get housing. And when we're looking at what we're seeing now in Florida, which we're seeing mass migration to all over Florida, we're seeing these rents going through the roof, right? And so when you enact rent control, we have to look at what's happening. Everything's going through the roof, everything, not just rent, but food, used car prices, clothing, everything is going through the roof. And so when everything is going through the roof, the more expensive things get, the more likely it is that we're going to need governmental assistance. We're going to need the overreach. We're going to need solutions. The old problem, reaction, solution. We're going to need a solution for this, right? And so this solution is going to be a very big invasion on property rights. Now, what I think ultimately the real solution would be is to incentivize builders and developers to build out more supply, more housing, maybe relax zoning policies in certain areas, to come up with a different way, another way. Because traditional business economics, if there's more available supply than demand, prices are going to come down. And if there's more demand than supply, prices are going to go up. Hence, Los Angeles and New York, the rents are so expensive. Now, in Florida, what we're seeing is record high prices people are paying for properties. And generally with these big property prices, we're seeing huge mortgages. So we're seeing high cost, we're seeing rising rates for insurance, we're seeing increased replacement costs for anything that needs to be fixed on the properties, increased utility costs. Things are just getting more expensive as a whole. And so if rents are only allowed to go up a certain percentage and things are going up by 20 or 30% for the property owner, what ultimately happens is that the property owner ends up getting bled out. And then what we ultimately see is we see an opportunity for large corporations to step forward and to monopolize housing. That's the big problem here, because the middle class is generally built on the 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, buying a little duplex, holding on to it for throughout retirement, owning that one property. And now we're seeing all these new laws and all these new regulations, all these new policies coming forward in places that we didn't expect it. A lot of people would say Florida would never happen in Florida. It's never going to happen in Texas. I personally think that what's happening in California and New York will be coming to Florida. It's already here. It's already approved 6-0. It's going to be going to Texas. It's going to be going to other areas. They're trying to roll it out right now in Colorado. They're trying to do all these things, right? And so it's pretty crazy to me how this whole thing works, because the more expensive the world gets for everybody else, the more of a hand that Big Brother is going to have throughout housing, throughout our entire lives, right? It's that problem, reaction, solution thing is very unique. It's very fascinating how quick that problem comes, then the reaction. Everyone's shocked about how rents are expensive and how food and everything is getting so expensive, and then boom, solution. But the question I ask myself is, how come they're not rolling out this type of quote-unquote solution on used car prices that are up 40%, or meat and produce, which are up over 10%, or clothing, or traditional materials, or car parts, or anything? They're not. Why? Because if they were to enact price controls, which they have discussed doing going forward. If they were to do this, what ultimately happened is that there would be supply chain issues simply because a lot of distributors would not be able to produce certain materials for cost that are inside of these price controls. So we would start to see a situation where there'd be a large black market, large transactions happening off of the grid, people paying 2, 3, 4, 5 times what they would have generally paid to get them on the black market. And it would be like a corporate takeover. We would see massive supply shortages. It would be a mess. Look at history, and it will show you how bad that was for everyday Americans. Now, if we're taking the same approach with rent control, we have to ask ourselves, is the solution to price fix housing, or is the solution simply to incentivize builders and developers and investors to build more housing, to give them tax credits or bonuses, or to work with them in cooperation? I know, for example, if I were running this country, if I was someone of substantial influence and I was here to try to fix some housing situation, the last thing I'd ever want to do is look at property owners and investors and developers as the problem. I would get them all in a room and I would say, hey, how can we work together to build 10% or 20% more housing? Because we could drop the rents 20 or 30% organically if we were to do that. How can we make it worthwhile for you to help build this out? What can we do together? How can we make this work? And I would work with the developers to make something happen. I would work with small property owners and say, hey, why don't we build ADUs, accessory dwelling units, little granny flats in your backyard? I'll give you a tax credit. We can build a unit, you can build out extra cash flow. Like, I would try to find out creative ways rather than building out more regulation, more restrictions, and more punishments for property owners to own, operate, and control rental housing. That's just my thoughts. I don't think that what they're doing now in Florida is a good thing. I've lived in LA for many, many years. I've studied New York. I've looked at where rent control has and has not worked, and more times than not, it doesn't work. More times than not, it makes the problem so much worse. But I'm curious as to what you think. Do you think we're going to see rent control coming to Miami? They're already talking about it. They already declared a housing emergency. Do you think it's going to come to Texas? Do you think it's going to go to Tennessee and other places where most people would say it would never happen, ever in a million years? Or do you think we're going to start to see rent control get nationalized in a large way, in a way to where housing is no longer attractive for an investor to step in because simply of all the red tape, all of the control that they lost? A lot of property owners would lose with a rent control situation. It's interesting. Like, for example, what rent control is, in another way of framing this, is it shifts the power dynamic in between a landlord and a tenant. Before, a landlord and tenant would have an open dialogue and a communication. Well, now in a place like Los Angeles, for example, where rent eviction moratoriums are enacted until June of 2023, which is pretty insane to me because everyone's still working in Los Angeles. Everyone's still moving forward on their day-to-day operations. But rent's optional till 2023. Now, if everyone was moving forward in that direction, where rents are optional until 2023, and we have all these different things, they're also now building out all of these systems. They already had them in place with networks such as Public Counsel and BASTA, which is a free tenant legal network. So if a tenant and landlord have a dispute, before, the landlord and tenant would each have to hire his or her own public attorney, and they pay $200, $300, $400 an hour for this. So they both were incentivized to kind of work together, so they didn't have to pay all that cost and deal with the animosity. However, now tenants get free legal networks through Public Counsel and BASTA and all these other networks. And so the tenants are like, hey, it doesn't matter to me. We'll go to court. And so then the landlord's bleeding out, and just begging to settle. And so it changes that relationship to where now tenants might be more incentivized to look at a landlord like, hey, I got nothing to lose. You're the one to lose everything if you don't do what I say. So everything is changing radically. Everything is changing radically. But I do believe housing is extremely unaffordable for everybody, and there needs to be a solution. I just don't think rent control is the solution. I think large-scale cooperation, working together as a team and a partnership, and building out incentives and programs to where people want to actually build housing, I think that's a better plan than regulating and restricting what limited housing we have in a lot of these desirable areas. But I'm curious, what do you think? Drop your comments below, hit the like button, subscribe here. Subscribe also on my second channel. It's going to be a podcast. I'm going to have some really smart and interesting people on there starting the first week of May. Also on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. Everything's in the banner. Catch you guys later.